You're saying you paid off the debt yourself. Even if that's true, a wife should respect her husband and keep quiet. Flaunting it like this is just shameless. My husband Jake had debts from before our marriage. The total was $300,000. I was the one who paid off that debt. Jake didn't have enough income to repay it, and he was barely making ends meet on a daily basis. Yet, he wanted me to pretend that I earned less than him and that he was the one repaying the debt. To maintain a good relationship with my in-laws, I had tolerated this for a long time. However, a certain event made me stop doing so. When my in-laws found out that I had paid off the debt, instead of thanking me, they insulted me by calling me shameless. Why do I have to be treated like this? I can't stay in this house anymore. I decided to leave everything behind and go. This would lead Jake and in-laws down a path of downfall. Jake and I are a couple in our 30s. We live with his parents. My father-in-law will retired a year ago, and my mother-in-law Mary has always been a homemaker. Me and Jake both work, but since Jake works at his office and I work from home, I did most of the household chores. I almost do as much housework as a full-time homemaker, yet I earn more than my husband. But my in-laws don't know this. Jake asked me to pretend that our household was running on his income alone. I guess he has some kind of pride. Initially, I thought it was fine for the sake of getting along with his family, so I complied. But it turned out that my husband had a $300,000 debt. Originally, it was a debt incurred by Will from a failed investment, leading to his bankruptcy. However, Jake became the guarantor, so we had to repay the $300,000. I was furious about being kept in the dark, but as we were both working, I thought we could repay it together. But it turned out that my husband's income wasn't enough for the repayment, and almost all of it had to come from my earnings. Then my husband wanted me to pretend that the debt repayment was being managed from his income. In reality, Will had already retired, and Mary had no income as a homemaker. Will's retirement money went partially to the debt, and there was none left. Naturally, all their savings for retirement, invested and lost, were gone. My in-laws believed their son was the one supporting the household. Thus, Jake was treated like a hero at home. Given the absolute trust he received from his parents, he couldn't admit to having a low income. But I didn't want to agree unconditionally to my husband's requests. I was done with surprises like finding out about the debt after getting married. So I proposed a condition to my husband. He didn't fully understand its implications, but readily agreed as long as I would take on the burden of the debt repayment. Years later, I repaid the entire $300,000 debt in place of Jake. I reported this to him in front of his parents. I thought that if I said it myself, even his parents would realize I helped finish the repayment. My in-laws never liked me working despite earning less than their son. Since you earn less than Jake, why don't you focus more on house chores? There's no point for a woman to compete with a man in work. Mary often said that to me. A woman should obey her husband, as she is nothing without him. That's what she believed. That's why she allowed her husband to make pool investment decisions. I thought she would at least acknowledge the trouble she caused me. But things didn't go as I expected. My in-laws praised their son for repaying the debt in a few years. And my husband was flattering his father, saying, "It's all for Dad. I am here because of him." Couldn't he just casually mention that his wife helped too? Irritated by Jake's attitude, I confessed that I was the one who shouldered the debt repayment and paid it off. Then my husband accused me. "Idiot, I told you to keep quiet. Why do you always have to be so assertive?" Even if that's true, it's a wife's duty to uphold her husband. Supporting your husband is the only job a wife has. Neither of my in-laws thanked me. Instead, they criticized me for not upholding my husband, boasting about it like this: "Nothing good comes from a woman being too forward. What's with this attitude of having paid off the debt? You're in a position of being supported by my son. How can you act like that? A woman's income isn't enough to live on, so she gets married to be supported by a man, right? You're saying you helped repay the debt, but you must have only contributed a little," and so on. My husband and in-laws kept hurling insults at me. The next day, things were a bit awkward, but life went back to normal. Since no one mentioned the debt issue, I thought it was over. However, a few days later at a family gathering, I experienced firsthand that the issue was still lingering. Even when I greeted them, not a single relative spoke to me. I realized I was completely ignored and excluded. At first, I wondered why, but then I overheard a gossip-loving relative loudly saying she kept the debt a secret until after the marriage. Her husband and father-in-law had to shoulder it. How shameless of her to claim she repaid it. And it was several $100,000. She was playing around with young male prostitutes. Apparently, she was about to be forced to work in dangerous places, but Jake kindly saved her. And yet she's rebellious, and so on. All of it was made up, but the relatives believed it. Most of them I only meet once a year, so there's not much interaction. Since they don't really know me, it's no surprise they believed someone who fed them lies. They never admitted their faults, hid inconvenient truths, and freely spread rumors as they pleased. Even my husband, who knew the truth, didn't correct them and went along with my in-law scheme. I wondered what I had been doing these past few years. Spending years accommodating Jake's silly pride now seemed utterly foolish. I silently packed my bags and returned to my parents' home. My husband was at work, and Mary was out to lunch with friends. The lunch money also coming from my income. Will was out for his daily walk. So it was the perfect opportunity. My absence caused a commotion only when Jake returned home. Until then, my in-laws hadn't noticed anything. It was expected since I had done all the housework before leaving. I didn't want my absence to be suspected before Jake returned home. I thought it wouldn't have the same impact otherwise. As expected, Jake called me right at his usual return time. When I answered the phone, he said, "What are you doing? Just because some relatives didn't pay attention to you, you run back to your parents' house. I can't believe you could be so selfish just because of some relatives." He has no idea how terrifying it is to be completely ignored and treated as if you don't exist. And to be treated just like a housekeeper by my own husband left me speechless. When I stayed silent, he started complaining over the phone. What about tomorrow's breakfast? Where are my spare dress shirts? My razor blades aren't in their usual place. So I snapped back. I didn't marry you to be a housekeeper. And I didn't agree to live with your parents. Your mother, a full-time homemaker, is there. Why don't you ask her? He seemed surprised by my response and fell silent for a moment. But then he retorted, "How can I ask my elderly mother to do housework? You are my wife, and you. A wife should just quietly obey her husband." I immediately responded that if there are 3 adults in the house, they should share the chores. I also added that I'd be willing to obey someone reliable. But I don't want to board a sinking ship by obeying someone like him. He was still ranting, but I didn't want to listen anymore, so I hung up. A week later, my in-laws started calling me persistently. I considered ignoring the call, but then thought it would be troublesome if they schemed something else. So I answered, only to be met with an immediate angry shout. "What have you done? Don't you have any gratitude for the support we provided you?" Normally, I would have replied, "What are you talking about?" But instead, I asked, "Who is this?" In fact, I had filed for divorce after returning to my parents' home. and it was already finalized. I thought it was a natural response to someone who didn't identify themselves but just shouted at me. My response enraged my former in-laws, who yelled, "Don't play dumb. Don't think you can just escape by running back to your parents' house. That's what cowards do." I argued that since the divorce was already finalized, what was wrong with staying at my parents' house? They abruptly hung up the phone. And a few hours later, my ex-husband and former in-laws showed up at my parents' house. Apparently, they came to confirm what I said. As soon as my ex-husband saw me, he confronted me, saying, "Don't file for divorce on your own. I don't remember agreeing to that. A forged divorce document is invalid," and he tried to grab me. I brushed off his hand and asked if he remembered the big fight we had before. My husband and I often argued about things like the debt repayment and whether our lifestyle was too extravagant for his income alone. But those disagreements escalated into a huge fight that almost led to divorce. During that time, my ex-husband prepared a divorce paper as a means to silence me, and it even had his signature on it. He had threatened me, saying, "If you talk back like that again, we're getting a divorce. I'm serious." He threw it at me, but I kept it, thinking it might be useful someday. So when I thought it was the right time, I just added my signature and submitted it to the office. From my perspective, using a signed divorce paper as a tool in a marital spat was unacceptable. I was thrown into a situation where I had to consider divorce seriously and kept silent to avoid arguments. I questioned him. "You threw the signed divorce paper at me, and now you say you didn't mean it." "Really?" At that, Jake fell silent, looking dejected. Then my former in-laws stepped forward as if it was their turn. They showed me a loan agreement and accused me of doing something terrible. We are family, and when a family member is in trouble, you help them. But to make a contract like this within a marriage, you are a horrible woman. They were completely denying everything I had done. I wanted to scream that I was the one who supported their lifestyle with my income. But I held back, fearing it would complicate things further. Back to the loan agreement. It was a document to avoid gift taxes for shouldering my husband's debt repayment. It stated that I was only repaying on his behalf and that he must repay me later. I wanted to avoid any potential taxation, so I made sure it was clear. At the time, my husband agreed to it without fully understanding its implications. I knew relatives would come again around Christmas, as they did every year. Not all of them, but some visited the family altar in my in-laws' house annually. So I hid the document in the altar's drawer, knowing someone familiar with the altar would eventually open it. The drawer usually held spare candles. My in-laws and ex-husband, being careless about such things, would eventually run out of supplies and use the spares. Human psychology dictates that one would check an unfamiliar item found in such a place. I cleverly used this to expose the truth about my in-laws and ex-husband. Naturally, the relatives scorned them as demon in-laws and a monstrous husband for making their daughter-in-law repay debts. They were already being shunned for spreading lies about the daughter-in-law who even shouldered their debts. It was a disgrace to the family. They were even told never to use the family name again. Their surname was somewhat unusual, so relatives suggested they change it, not wanting to be associated with them. Mary's maiden name was more common, so they might end up changing it. I'm not sure about the legal aspect, but that was their own doing. I told my former in-laws, I worked, did all the housework, repaid your father's debt, and you spread lies about me to the relatives. And to degrade someone's reputation with false stories, is that what families do? This is what they call poetic justice. I said it all with a smile. I had a final word from my still shocked ex-husband. I'll need you to strictly repay the $300,000 I loaned you. pay on time, or I'll demand full repayment at once if you're late. Okay, I showed him the loan agreement with a smile. A smile can be more intimidating than anger in such situations. The three of them, who had confidently confronted me, were now clearly intimidated. They must have thought I wouldn't dare to stand up to them. I must have seemed like a different person in their eyes. I told them to communicate through a lawyer from now on. If they ever showed up unannounced again, or called persistently like before, I would report them for harassment and stalking. They begged me to spare them from involving the police, bowed their heads, and slunk away in defeat. Their departure was the sad retreat of those who had lost. Afterward, my former in-law's house fell into complete disarray. It seems they finally realized that their son's income alone could not sustain their previous standard of living. Now that they knew how much they had depended on my income, it was too late. Perhaps my warning that any further contact would be reported to the authorities worked, as they did not come to me for money. Former mother-in-law apparently decided to start working part-time to maintain their lifestyle. However, finding a job was difficult for someone who had never worked outside before. Especially in her 60s, I heard she was struggling to get hired. Will, having worked until retirement, was optimistic about finding work quickly. However, as he was promoted only due to seniority and lacked competence, he couldn't find even part-time work. As a result, they were struggling so much that even daily meals became a challenge. My ex-husband continued his regular job and started doing part-time work to pay back the debt to me, working every evening on weekdays and all day on weekends. All his part-time earnings went to debt repayment, leaving no improvement in his life despite all the hard work. He became so haggard that he looked over 10 years older from his actual age. I heard he made a major mistake at his primary job and was in a precarious position. After a while, I moved out of my parents' house and started living alone. Without being forced to do housework for others and with the ability to focus on work, my efficiency increased, leading to a raise. I'm now enjoying a fulfilling life, able to use my time and money for myself.